Spirit of unity. I looked up the word unity. Being together or at one with someone or something, it is the opposite of being divided. It is wholeness. I looked in the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 1 says, they were all together in one place. If you look at the King James Version, it says they were all together in one Honda. Oh, no, in accord. They were all together in one accord. That's just a prelude of things to come, folks. Ephesians 4:1 states, we are to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Philippians chapter 2 discusses being one in spirit and in purpose. The definition of unity. Is it the opposite of being divided? I can be in unity in action. I can be with a group that decides to do something, and because it's the pleasures of the group, I can go along with that thing. But I can be divided in spirit. And I think there's really a deep importance here, because unity isn't just going along with the group. Unity is the deep inside feeling that I am doing what I'm doing because it's the right thing to do, not just because the group says to do it. It's a following the crowd and being happy about it. A group can be in unity in action, but still be divided in spirit. Let me give you an example. Some years back, we were in a small church. Nothing new about that. Most churches are small. And this church had 15 the first Sunday we were there. That included the 5 of us. Jennifer was a month old. And it included the next door neighbor to the church who was a Catholic who came to see who her new neighbor was. We decided to start the Nazarene caravans programs. We had 5 or 6 kids around eventually. And when it came up in the church board, after great discussion, there were 8 yeses and 1 adamant no. And after the vote came, the lady looked at me and had some comments, and I had some comments back to her that broke the whole tension of the moment. But I got to tell you, the first person to sign up to work in caravans was the person who voted no. And she didn't do it just because it was to go along with the crowd. It was because when the group said, this is what we're going to do, she thought, this is what we need to do. She became unified, not just in action, but in spirit. And went along not just because the group said to go along, but because she felt like we've got to do it. And her whole reason for not doing it is because it's going to cost money. Everything costs money. If it didn't cost money, man, we could blow the roof off the place. But that would cost money too to repair it. Sometimes it's as though we're standing on the outside, but we're sitting on the inside. That's not unity. If we're going to stand on the outside, we've got to stand on the inside as well. Unity is not agreeing on everything, but it's thinking towards the same end. Just because I like broccoli doesn't mean you have to like broccoli. But our means of using the broccoli is to feed ourselves so we get stronger physically and mentally. I don't have to agree on the same way to get there, but I have to look at what the end result is, and that's what we're heading for. I looked through the Bible at a whole bunch of examples of unity. John chapter 17, verses 20 to 21, we find Jesus is praying to God. And in that prayer, he says that all of them, the disciples, may be one as you and I are one. Ephesians 4:4 says, there is one body and one spirit. Philippians 4:5 says, your attitude should be that of Jesus Christ. I'm driving them crazy back there. I'm going kind of fast on these scriptures. I think about Jesus and God being one, Father and Son. I've been thinking about father and son relationships, the correlation of a father raising his son. And I've been thinking about that scripture about raising a child the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. And I'm finding that the more mature I get, old, the more characteristics of my dad I have, whether I like it or not. My dad is people think I'm a type A personality. My dad's AAA. At 92 years old, he's still AAA. He's hyper. He can't sit down. He can't relax. He can't let things go. And so I have picked up that from him a little bit. My father is a very compassionate man. He's the patriarch of the family. I keep joking around that I'm taking lessons from him on how to be the family patriarch. I keep finding our oldest daughter and our son both calling me and saying, Dad, what do you think about this? And I'm acting like a patriarch and giving them answers. I don't know if they're using them or not or liking them or not, but I'm looking at this whole thing of the Father and the Son acting alike, being alike. And I look at Jesus and the Father, and this prayer of Jesus to the disciples, I pray that they will be one, the disciples, as you and I are one. Well, how are Jesus and God one? They were one in body. They were one in spirit. Father, Son. Their purpose was identically the same, to bring mankind back to God. To seek salvation for man so that he could be in one relationship with God once again. To have them together in this unity of love, this bond of love, that they think alike. The same purpose. And then I find Jesus saying, I want my disciples to be one as you and I are one. And so I find the Spirit coming down to our lives and getting this love into us that just pours out to everybody else. And so we become unified in love. We become unified in our actions of how we treat other people. With kindness and respect. We become one in our desire to have the gospel message reach out to all people around us. And yes, we can have discussions that don't always agree with each other, and we can come to a common bond where we come out with a plan that this is how we're going to do to reach out to some folks. And it all came because God put us together and allowed us to sit together and talk about things and come up with a unified plan of action. One in spirit, not divided, not everybody doing their own thing. And then I look at this where it says in Philippians 4:5, your attitude should be that of Christ Jesus. Well, I want you to look at verses 6 through 8 of Philippians chapter 4. Except I have the wrong chapter I just told you. Let's try Philippians chapter 2. Did I give you the wrong back there, Kurt? Philippians chapter 2. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Attitude of Jesus Christ. Not more important than God. Did not consider his equality with God something that was important, but humbled himself to come to earth, to do Jesus Christ, to do God's work. The nature of God says, I do His work in His way. I look at this whole thing of the importance of unity. Back over in John 17, verse 21. Let them be unified, so the world may believe that you sent me. That's Jesus talking to God. That the world may believe that you sent me. Had a man in church some years ago. His wife came to church. Her name was Myrtle. Kids called her Myrtle the Turtle. That way they could remember her name. Her husband did not come to church. They lived 2 doors from the church. And I asked her about her husband one day, and she said, don't you dare go meet him. That kind of shocked me. So you know what I did? I went over and met him. I found out we had a lot in common. He was a car freak, so was I. But in the course of conversations over several weeks, he said, you'll never see me in church. I said, why? He said, well, number one, that's my wife's thing, not her thing, not my thing, and she doesn't want me around her things. But he said, number two, I find more fellowship at the corner bar than I ever did in a church. That was sad, so sad. And I began to talk to him and began to realize that he had never seen a group of Christians unified. He had never seen a group of Christians who were willing to pray to reach out to the world around him. He had never seen a group of people who really cared for each other. But at the corner bar, he found that friendship. At the corner bar, he found that fellowship. And so as I look at this whole thing of unity, I'm realizing we as Christians need to be praying. We need to be unified by God so that the world will see a difference, that will reach out to them and that will get their attention, that they can say, there's really something about this Christianity. Those people love God, they love each other, and they're trying to do the same thing and not fighting about it. Unity. Unity. Ephesians 4:3 says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Went to a church that needed a lot of work, and I started talking to the people of the church, how are we going to do this work? And they said, oh, we're so heavy in debt. We owe everybody in the world money, and there's no way we can do a parking lot, and there's no way we can get a new well in the church. I said, but you got 3 people bringing gallons of water to church every week just for drinking and flushing and things like that. The well's not working, your parking lot's mud. We've got to do something. And so when they're looking at it, I discovered that they had sold bonds to build their building, and they had never paid on the bonds. We got it all worked out and got things caught up and took out a bank mortgage. But as I thought about what a bond means, a bond is a promise. They made a promise to people they would pay that money back. A bond is something that binds or restrains. It's something that pulls us together. It's something that you cannot break. One way or another is going to come to fruition. Make every effort to keep the unity of spirit through the bond of peace. The relationship between God and Christ becomes a bond, a promise of hope, a way of life. And so when they start talking about the bond of peace, God has given us peace in our lives. God has given us this unity through the peace. And he's talking about the bond of peace, something that we dare not break. To go against this is sinning against God. Now I look at this whole thing of unity and I realize it was and it is a problem. Paul addressed it in several of his letters, in Ephesians, Philippians, Thessalonians. Luke addressed it in Acts, Jesus in his own words. And so I've come to the conclusion, when I do not go after unity and peace, I'm quenching the Spirit. And so the spirit of unity has to come down onto my life and be poured down on me so that I can share that spirit with other people. I can't do it on my own. God has to help me do it. I look in Philippians chapter 2, the first 5 verses. Here's what unity brings about. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ. We need unity. We need encouragement. There are days when we get up, let's just face it, where you just feel like you can't go another second. There are days when things happen in your life that you just feel so discouraged and so down and out, and so you just why bother? If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, being united with Christ should give us encouragement to keep on going, because He's got the power to keep us going every day of the week. If you have any comfort from His love. As I talk to especially older folks who live by themselves, who do not have a close relationship of friends who come and see them, as I talk to people in the nursing homes who at times nobody comes to visit them. All they see are the caregivers that are there for them, and maybe the people they eat with them if they're fortunate enough to go down to the cafeteria to eat. I find people feeling hopeless, depressed, almost in despair. And then I realize that one thing that we really need is love to make us feel comfortable. If you live in a home where there's no love, you don't feel comfortable and content. And so we find that one of the things here to unity is love that brings comfort, that brings encouragement, and then that moves on down, and it says, if there's any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete. This is Paul talking. By being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and in purpose. What's our purpose? To spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. What's our purpose? To share His love around. How do we do that? With His Spirit coming on us and unifying us in that bond of peace, that bond of love. And from that comes encouragement, comes tenderness, comes compassion, comes joy, comes everything that's involved with that. I've looked through the Bible at what takes place when we allow the unity of the Spirit to come into our lives. Back to Acts chapter 2. God's raw power takes over, and they all get together in that Honda minivan and go down the road together. Acts chapter 2 says, they spilled out into the streets. It says that new believers were brought into the kingdom because they saw the genuineness of Christianity. They believed it, not because it was just talked about, but because they saw the power of God in action. When the unity of Spirit comes upon us, people begin to see the unity of the Spirit in action. I sometimes think that we worry too much about little particular things, and what we really need to worry about is just plain old revival. I keep hearing different people say, we need a revival. Well, we talk about revivals and we think about the great days of the big tent meetings and the great days of camp meetings and the great days of, this church was started with a tent over on Fairmont Avenue. It had been a Sunday school on Hobby Heights on, what was the street you guys used to live on? Cottage, on Cottage Avenue, right over there by where they used to live. They moved on to Fairmont, and some of you, Madeline, have great memories of Fairmont days. They put up a tent. They moved into a church basement. God's power took over. And we talk about those revival days. When we say we want revival, I'll tell you where it has to start, with me. It has to start in our own personal lives. Some of you may remember back at our days at Olivet a couple of years ago, there were a couple of different times where revival just hit campus. I remember one time in particular where revival had hit and a chapel speaker failed to show up. And they turned it over just to testimonies that day because if I remember right, campus revival had just ended and a lot of people had just changed their lives around. Did any of you remember a guy by the name of Larry Blight? Larry was a big guy. He was loud and boisterous. He drove fast. He ran fast. Everything Larry did was just full of loudness and exuberance and just carrying on. Larry was from my home church. I grew up around him. He was a couple years older than I was. I remember very well Larry being one of those on campus that you just knew was going to be involved in trouble if trouble was around. That's just the way Larry was. And yet my parents allowed me to ride back and forth from Michigan with him. I made some fast trips those days at 85 and 90 miles an hour because he wanted to get here fast. I remember very well Larry getting up in chapel one morning and saying, "Last night at an altar, I told the devil to bite the wall." And Larry's life changed from that moment on because he got revival in his soul. Larry went on to pastor on the West Coast and in Hawaii and back up in Oregon. Larry's gone on to his eternal reward here a couple of years back from a lot of physical problems. But he said, "I want the revival to start with me." I look at what happened in the upper room. There were 120 disciples together for 7 days. Now, I've wondered about that a lot. I've wondered about what did they do for food? How many bathrooms were in that room? Were there any showers there? I mean, I've had all these weird thoughts. What did they do up there for 7 days? You know, I've thought about, you get kids together sometimes and they're battling things out and they just seem to be fighting all the time. And what do? You throw them in a room and tell them just to battle it out. When they come out later as friends because they made peace. I've asked myself, is that what happened in the upper room? I don't think so. I think when they went into that upper room, I think it was real people with real questions, needing real answers, who spent time talking and praying and waiting on God to see what God was going to do in their lives, because he said, "Wait for me, wait in Jerusalem for the power of the Spirit to come on you." And so they prayed, and they talked, and they shared. And they talked about the things that Jesus had talked to them about. They talked about the things that they knew. They talked about the fact that they couldn't do anything on their own unless the Spirit fell on them. And when the Spirit came, you know the story. They went into action. The people around heard the noise. They heard the mighty rushing wind. I've been waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I keep hearing this loud, almost like a wind blowing somewhere. And it just goes on and on and on. And I'm trying to figure out, what is it? It's west of us somehow, but what is it? And I figured it out this morning. When I was picking the kids up, I started hearing this little noise, and I looked over, and it seemed to be coming from the steel plants over there, not too far from your house. Just this loud noise that sounded almost like a blast furnace going. It gets my attention. I keep hearing a noise about 5:15 in the morning that sounds like metal crashing together. I've decided they must be hooking up train cars somewhere. It's always to the west of us. I wake up about 2:30 in the morning, night after night. It seems to be mostly on Saturday nights, hearing this loud rumbling noise. And then I hear the train whistles. Ooh, ooh. I don't know how some of you who live by the tracks can stand it. It drives me crazy where we live. You see, the rushing mighty wind came through that upper room, and it got everybody's attention. Then all of a sudden, here come the disciples running from that room and down the steps and out into the streets, talking about the power of God, talking about salvation. They were unified in purpose. They were unified in spirit. They got above their individual needs and their desires, and they went for the good of the whole group. They didn't worry about cost or time or effort or organization. That came later. They just did it because God came on them. Acts chapter 2 says, they were one. in one accord, of the same mind, of the same purpose. Acts 4:32 says, the believers were of one heart and soul. People talk about their soulmates. They were all soulmates back there. They were together. They cared for each other. Verse 33 of chapter 4 says, and they had great power. I've come to the simple conclusion. The only way the gospel message is going to be spread is when we are unified in our purpose of reaching the gospel. There's all kinds of methods to do it, but our purpose has to be spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the neat thing is, He gives us a spirit of unity. He gives us a spirit of peace. He gives us the power to do it. And we become one. One in the bond of love. Remember that? That's that word again, bond. That ties us together. That keeps us together.